You think of samurai, you think of honor, discipline, the warrior's code, men who lived and died by strict rules about loyalty, duty, and respect. But here's what almost nobody talks about. These same warriors had sexual practices that would shock most people today. Practices that were not only accepted, but celebrated. Practices that were written about in literature, depicted in art, and considered completely normal for hundreds of years. The samurai class had formalized relationships between adult warriors and teenage boys. They visited elaborate pleasure districts where they spent fortunes on courtesans. They collected explicit art that would make modern people blush. And all of this was documented, legal, and in many cases, encouraged by society. Every single thing I'm about to tell you comes from historical records, personal diaries, legal documents, and art that still exists in museums today. By the end of this video, you'll understand that the samurai were far more complex than any movie has ever shown. So let's talk about what really happened behind the closed doors of samurai society. Before we dive into the specific practices, you need to understand something crucial about Japanese culture during the samurai era. Their attitude towards sexuality was completely different from what most Western societies believed at the same time. In ancient Japan, before Buddhism arrived from China in the 6th century, the native Shinto religion didn't have a concept of sexual sin. Sexuality was seen as natural, as normal as eating or sleeping. It was connected to fertility, to life itself, to the power of creation. There was no shame attached to it, no concept of certain sexual acts being inherently wrong or dirty. When Buddhism came to Japan, it brought new ideas, but it didn't completely replace the old attitudes. Instead, Japanese culture blended these beliefs together in unique ways. Even Buddhist monks, who were supposed to be celibate, often had sexual relationships that were openly acknowledged. The contradiction didn't bother people the way it might bother Western observers. Then, during the Tokugawa period starting in 1603, Confucian philosophy became the official ideology of the samurai government. Confucianism brought strict ideas about social order, about everyone having their proper place, about duty to family and lord. But even Confucianism didn't create the same sexual restrictions that Christianity created in Europe. The focus was on producing heirs and maintaining social hierarchy, not on policing private sexual behavior. So the samurai grew up in a culture where sexuality was acknowledged, discussed, and regulated, but not hidden or treated as shameful. This context is essential for understanding everything else I'm about to tell you. Now let's talk about who the samurai actually were, because this matters for understanding their sexual practices. The samurai weren't just warriors. They were an entire social class, a hereditary military nobility that made up about 5 to 10% of Japan's population during the Edo period. At the top were the daimyo, the great lords who controlled entire provinces. Below them were various ranks of samurai, from wealthy retainers who lived in castles to lower-ranking samurai who were barely better off than wealthy peasants. But all of them shared certain privileges and followed certain codes of conduct. The samurai lived by Bushido, the way of the warrior. This code emphasized loyalty to your lord above everything else, even your own life. It demanded courage in battle, skill with weapons, and a willingness to die rather than face dishonor. These men trained from childhood to be fighters, to be ready to kill or be killed at any moment. But here's what most people don't realize. These same warriors were also expected to be cultured, educated, refined. A proper samurai could write poetry. He understood tea ceremony. He appreciated art and music. He could conduct himself with elegance in social situations. The samurai ideal wasn't just a brutal fighter. It was a complete person who balanced violence with culture, strength with sensitivity. And that balance extended to sexuality. The samurai had very specific ideas about appropriate sexual behavior, but those ideas were very different from what modern people might expect. Before we go further, I want to be clear about why we're discussing this topic and how we're going to approach it. This is history. This is educational content based on documented facts. I'm not making moral judgments about practices from 400 years ago. I'm not promoting or condemning anything. I'm simply explaining what actually happened, based on the historical record. The sources for everything I'm going to tell you include personal diaries written by samurai, official government records, legal documents, literature published during the Edo period, artwork that's preserved in museums, letters between individuals, and temple records. We also have accounts from European missionaries and traders who visited Japan and wrote about what they observed, often in shocked detail. Understanding samurai sexual practices isn't just about satisfying curiosity. It's about seeing a complete picture of history. For too long, Western historians either ignored these aspects of samurai culture or dismissed them as aberrations. But you can't understand the samurai without understanding their complete lives, including their intimate relationships and sexual customs. These practices also challenge modern assumptions about sexuality and history. They show us that different cultures have had vastly different ideas about what's normal, what's acceptable, and what's honorable. The samurai didn't see any contradiction between their strict warrior code and sexual practices that seem shocking today. To them, it all fit together into a coherent worldview. So as we go through this information, I want you to think about it in historical context. These were real people living in a real society with its own logic and values. Understanding them means temporarily setting aside our modern judgments and trying to see the world Now, with that foundation in place, let's start with the most documented and perhaps most surprising aspect of samurai sexuality. The practice called Wakashudo, or Shudo for short, the way of youths. A formalized system of relationships between adult samurai warriors and adolescent boys that was not only accepted but celebrated in samurai society for centuries. And I need to warn you, some of what you're about to hear will be uncomfortable. But it's all historically documented, and understanding it is essential to understanding the real samurai, not the sanitized movie version. Let's begin. The practice was called Wakashudo, sometimes shortened to just Shudo. The literal translation is the way of youths or the way of young men, and this was a formalized system of age-structured same-sex relationships between adult samurai warriors and adolescent boys. Now, before you jump to conclusions, understand that the samurai themselves didn't think of this as homosexuality in the way we understand that term today. This wasn't about sexual orientation or identity. It was about a specific type of relationship that had defined roles, social functions, and cultural meaning. It was temporary, structured, and considered a normal part of growing up in samurai society. Here's how it worked. An adult samurai, called the ninja, would form a bond with a younger male, called the wakashu, who was typically between 11 and 19 years old. The ninja was the older partner, the protector, the mentor. The wakashu was the younger partner, the student, the one being guided into adulthood and warrior culture. This relationship had multiple dimensions. It was educational. The ninja taught the wakashu martial skills, strategy, and the ways of samurai culture. It was social. The ninja introduced the wakashu to important people and helped advance his position. It was emotional. These bonds created intense loyalty between the partners. And yes, it was sexual. That aspect was acknowledged, accepted, and considered a natural part of the relationship. These relationships weren't secret or shameful. They were often formalized with ceremonies, sometimes with written contracts, and occasionally with witnesses from respected samurai families. This wasn't something happening in the shadows. This was mainstream samurai culture from roughly the 12th century through the 19th century. We're talking about 700 years of documented history. How do we know all this? Because the samurai and their contemporaries wrote about it extensively. They didn't hide it because they didn't think there was anything to hide. One of the most famous sources is a book called Nanshoku Okagami, which translates to The Great Mirror of Male Love. It was written by Ihara Saikaku in 1687 during the Edo period. Saikaku was one of the most celebrated writers of his time, and this book contains 40 detailed stories about male-male love relationships. Some involve samurai and their wakashu. Others involve kabuki actors and their admirers. The book was popular, widely read, and considered a legitimate work of literature, not pornography or scandal. Even earlier, from the 14th century, we have scrolls called Chigo no Soshi, which means the acolyte's tale. These illustrated scrolls depict relationships between Buddhist monks and their young acolytes. The artwork is explicit, and these scrolls were preserved in temples as legitimate religious and artistic objects. We have personal diaries from Tokugawa-era samurai that mention their wakashu by name, describe their feelings, and include love poems they wrote for these young men. We have letters between samurai that discuss these relationships openly. The language they used wasn't coded or hidden. It was direct. Even the Hagakure, the famous text about the samurai code written by Yamamoto Tsunetomo in the early 1700s, mentions these relationships. It discusses the proper way to conduct them, the honor involved, the loyalty expected. It treats Wakashudo as a normal part of samurai life that needed to be done correctly, with dignity and respect. The historical evidence is overwhelming. This wasn't a fringe practice. This was mainstream samurai culture. So why did samurai society embrace Wakashudo? There were multiple reasons, and understanding them helps us see the logic behind the practice. First, practical circumstances. Samurai spent long periods in military camps, away from women. They lived in all-male environments during campaigns and training. In these settings, emotional and sexual bonds formed between men of different ages. Rather than suppress or punish this, samurai culture formalized it, gave it structure and rules. Second, military bonding. The relationship between ninja and wakashu created intense loyalty. In battle, you would fight harder to protect someone you had this kind of bond with. You would be more willing to die for them. The samurai understood that these emotional connections made their military units stronger and more cohesive. It was strategic as much as it was personal. Third, the mentorship model. Samurai society needed to train the next generation of warriors. Having an older samurai take personal responsibility for a younger one's development was an effective teaching system. The ninja had direct incentive to train the wakashu well, to pass on skills and knowledge, to shape him into a capable warrior. Fourth, Buddhist precedent. Japanese Buddhist monasteries had similar practices between monks and acolytes for centuries. Since Buddhism was deeply influential in samurai culture, this provided a cultural template that made Wakashudo seem normal and acceptable. Fifth, aesthetic ideals. Samurai culture celebrated a specific type of beauty in young men. The wakashu had a distinctive appearance, a particular hairstyle with a forelock called maigami, specific clothing styles, sometimes makeup. This aesthetic was celebrated in art, literature, and poetry. Having a beautiful, refined wakashu reflected well on the ninja. It showed taste, status, and cultural sophistication. And sixth, it didn't threaten the family structure. Remember, samurai still had to marry women and produce heirs. Wakashudo relationships were understood to be temporary, lasting only until the young man reached full adulthood. Then he would transition to marriage and eventually might take his own wakashu. The practice existed alongside heterosexual marriage, not instead of it. These relationships had structure, expectations, and sometimes formal elements that made them socially recognized bonds. Some relationships involved written contracts or oaths. These documents would specify the nature of the bond, the responsibilities of each partner, and the duration of the relationship. In some cases, respected samurai would witness these agreements, giving them official weight. The ninja had clear responsibilities. He was expected to provide martial training, teaching the wakashu sword techniques, archery, horseback riding, and military strategy. He introduced the wakashu to important people in samurai society, helping him build connections that would serve him throughout life. He protected the wakashu in battle, literally putting his life on the line for his younger partner. He provided financial support, paying for the wakashu's equipment, clothing, and needs. And he offered emotional guidance, helping the wakashu navigate the complex world of samurai politics and social expectations. The wakashu also had responsibilities. His primary duty was absolute loyalty to his ninja. He was expected to learn quickly and demonstrate the skills being taught. He accompanied his ninja to battle and fought beside him. He maintained his appearance according to the aesthetic standards of wakashu culture, and he was expected to eventually transition to full manhood with grace, maintaining honor for both himself and his former ninja. The wakashu occupied an interesting social position. They weren't considered fully male yet, but they weren't female either. They were a third category, visually distinct and socially recognized. Their specific hairstyle, the Megami forelock, marked them as wakashu. When that forelock was cut during the Genpuku coming-of-age ceremony, it signified the transition to full adult manhood. At that point, the sexual aspect of the relationship would end, though close friendship often continued. This visual distinction was important. You could look at someone and immediately know they were wakashu. It was public information, not hidden, and the culture produced extensive art celebrating wakashu beauty. Woodblock prints, paintings, and illustrations depicted wakashu as aesthetic ideals. This wasn't underground material. This was displayed art, sold openly, collected by samurai families. Wakashudo wasn't practiced identically everywhere. Different regions and different social levels had their own variations. The Kyushu region, the southern island of Japan, was particularly associated with samurai wakashudo traditions. The Satsuma domain, which would later play a crucial role in the Meiji Restoration, was famous for its warrior culture and its embrace of these practices. Satsuma samurai were known for masculine ideals and intense male bonding. Their version of wakashudo emphasized the military and loyalty aspects more than the aesthetic refinement. In contrast, the cultural centers of Kyoto and Edo, which is modern-day Tokyo, had more refined, aesthetically focused versions of these relationships. In these urban environments, the beauty of the wakashu, his cultural accomplishments, and the poetry exchanged between partners received more emphasis. It was more romantic and less purely martial. Class differences also mattered. High-ranking samurai, the daimyo and their close retainers, practiced wakashudo with more ceremony and formality. These relationships might involve elaborate gift-giving, poetry exchanges, and social events where the pair appeared together publicly. Lower-ranking samurai practiced it more informally, with less ceremony, but often with equally strong emotional bonds. Buddhist monasteries had their own version involving monks and chigo, the young temple acolytes. This paralleled samurai wakashudo, but existed in a religious context. Some of the earliest documentation of these practices comes from temple records and religious artwork. These relationships had natural endpoints built into the system. The primary marker was the Genpuku ceremony, the coming-of-age ritual where a young man officially became an adult samurai. This usually happened between ages 15 and 20, though the exact timing varied. During Genpuku, the Wakashu's forelock would be cut off and his hair would be styled in the adult male fashion. He would receive adult clothing and often a new name. This ceremony marked the transition from Wakashu to full samurai status. At this point, the sexual relationship with the ninja was expected to end. The former Wakashu was now an adult and was expected to marry a woman and begin producing heirs. This was his duty to his family and clan. However, the emotional bond with the ninja often remained strong. These men had gone through intense experiences together, fought in battles together, shared years of intimate connection. Many remained close friends and allies throughout their lives. Some former Wakashu would then take their own Wakashu, continuing the cycle. The mentorship model perpetuated itself across generations. A man who had been guided and trained as a Wakashu would then guide and train the next generation. This created lineages of loyalty and connection that strengthened samurai clans. It's crucial to understand that this system worked because it was time-limited and because it existed alongside, not instead of, heterosexual marriage and reproduction. The samurai saw no contradiction between having a Wakashu in your youth or having a Wakashu as an adult mentor, and also being married to a woman and having children. These were different aspects of life that served different purposes. Now, speaking of marriage, let's talk about what samurai marriage actually looked like, because the reality was very different from modern romantic ideals, and understanding it helps explain why samurai men sought emotional and sexual satisfaction in other places. Now let's talk about samurai marriage, because understanding this helps explain why samurai men sought intimacy elsewhere. Samurai marriage was not about love. It was not about personal happiness. It was a political and economic transaction between families. Marriages were arranged, often when the people involved were still children. A daimyo would marry his daughter to another daimyo's son to create an alliance between their domains. Lower-ranking samurai did the same on a smaller scale. The bride and groom often met for the first time at their wedding ceremony. Their personal feelings about each other were completely irrelevant. The wife's primary job was simple: produce a male heir. That was it. That was her most important function. If she failed to produce a son, she could be divorced and sent back to her family in disgrace. If she did produce a son, her position became more secure, but her life didn't necessarily become happier. Samurai wives lived in a separate part of the house. They were called okusan, which literally means person of the interior. They stayed inside. They managed the household, supervised servants, and raised children, but they had very limited interaction with their husbands. The husband would visit the wife's quarters when he wanted to attempt producing an heir, and that was often the extent of their intimate contact. This wasn't a partnership. This wasn't companionship. This was duty. Both sides understood that. The wife knew her husband would seek emotional connection and sexual pleasure elsewhere. The husband knew his wife was there for one purpose: continuing the family line. Some couples did develop genuine affection over time, and we have records of that happening. But it wasn't the expectation or the norm. The loneliness of samurai wives is documented in letters and literature from the period. These women, often highly educated and cultured, spent their lives in isolation, their worth measured entirely by their ability to produce sons. Because producing a male heir was so crucial, wealthy samurai often had concubines, called mikake. These were women who lived in the samurai's household, with official status but lower rank than the wife. Their purpose was straightforward: provide backup options for producing heirs and offer sexual variety to the master. A wealthy daimyo might have dozens of concubines. Tokugawa-era, the founder of the Tokugawa shogunate, had multiple concubines and fathered many children with them. This wasn't scandalous. This wasn't hidden. Everyone knew about it, including his official wife. The children born to concubines were legitimate. but they had lower status than children born to the official wife. If the wife failed to produce a son, a concubine's son could inherit. This created intense competition and political maneuvering within samurai households. Concubines would try to position their sons favorably. Wives would try to undermine concubines. It was a pressure cooker of rivalry and intrigue. If a samurai had no sons at all, even with concubines, the solution was adoption. A samurai could adopt an adult male, often from a related family branch, to become his heir. This was legally and socially acceptable. The absolute worst outcome was having no heir at all, which could mean the end of the family line and the loss of the family's lands and position. The obsession with male heirs drove everything. It justified concubinage. It put enormous pressure on women who faced dangerous childbirth multiple times. It created succession disputes that sometimes led to clan conflicts and even small wars. This wasn't just personal anxiety. This was the foundation of samurai society, and everyone lived under its weight. Given the cold, dutiful nature of samurai marriage, where did samurai men go for actual pleasure, for emotional connection, for excitement? The answer is the licensed pleasure quarters, and the most famous was Yoshiwara in Edo. Yoshiwara was a walled district where prostitution was legal, regulated, and taxed by the government. It wasn't hidden in back alleys. It was an official institution. The shogunate created these licensed districts to control and profit from prostitution, and they became cultural centers of Edo period Japan. But Yoshiwara wasn't just about sex. It was where fashion started. It was where new music and art forms developed. It was where samurai and wealthy merchants could interact socially, which rarely happened elsewhere because of strict class separation. The pleasure quarters were spaces where normal social rules relaxed slightly. For samurai, visiting Yoshiwara was considered completely normal. Young, unmarried samurai went regularly. Married samurai went regularly. Their wives knew about it and accepted it as part of life. There was no shame attached to it for men. It was just what men did. The cost, however, was enormous. The top courtesans, called oiran, charged prices that would bankrupt lower-ranking samurai. Many samurai went into serious debt to afford regular visits to high-class courtesans. This debt was so common that it became a social problem, and the government occasionally issued edicts trying to limit samurai spending in the pleasure quarters. These edicts were largely ignored. The oiran were not ordinary prostitutes. They were celebrities, artists, and cultural icons. They were highly educated, trained in music, poetry, dance, and conversation. They wore incredibly elaborate kimono that cost fortunes. Their hairstyles were architectural marvels, and they had the right to refuse clients. You couldn't just show up with money and expect an oiran to see you. You had to be introduced properly, go through rituals, prove yourself worthy of her time. The relationship between samurai and courtesans was complex. On one level, it was a business transaction. The samurai paid. The courtesan provided company and sex. But the culture around it was romantic and emotional. Literature from the Edo period is filled with stories of samurai falling desperately in love with courtesans. These stories usually ended tragically because the class difference made marriage impossible. A samurai who actually married a former prostitute would lose his samurai status in most cases. But these romantic tragedies were popular entertainment, suggesting that emotional connections between samurai and courtesans did develop. Some samurai formed long-term arrangements with specific courtesans, essentially keeping them as mistresses. The samurai would pay regularly to ensure the courtesan saw only him. This gave the illusion of a relationship while maintaining the transactional nature underneath. Lower-ranking courtesans, the general category called yujo, were more straightforwardly transactional. These were the women most samurai actually interacted with regularly, since they were affordable. The romantic stories about oiran were aspirational. The reality for most samurai was more mundane, commercial sex. Geisha were different from courtesans, though people often confuse them. Originally, geisha were entertainers, not prostitutes. They were trained in arts and conversation and were hired to entertain at parties. Over time, some geisha did engage in sexual relationships with patrons, but it wasn't their primary purpose. Samurai would hire geisha to perform at gatherings, to add cultural sophistication to an event. The samurai class was surrounded by explicit sexual material in a way that might surprise modern people. Shunga, which means spring pictures, were erotic woodblock prints that were everywhere in Edo period Japan. These prints were explicitly sexual, showing intercourse and other sexual acts in graphic detail. The genitals were often exaggerated to enormous, almost comical proportions. But these weren't considered pornography in the modern sense. They were art, entertainment, and education all at once. Famous artists like Katsushika Hokusai, who created the iconic Great Wave print, also created extensive shunga. Kitagawa Utamaro, celebrated for his beautiful portraits of women, made shunga. These weren't underground artists making forbidden material. These were the most respected artists of their time, and shunga was just one category of their work. Samurai households commonly owned shunga prints. They were given as wedding gifts to educate newlyweds. They were considered good luck charms. Samurai would look at them for entertainment, or to get ideas for their own sexual encounters. There was no shame in owning them or enjoying them. Literature was equally explicit. Ihara Saikaku, who wrote The Great Mirror of Male Love that we mentioned earlier, also wrote extensively about heterosexual encounters. His work described sexual techniques, romantic adventures, and the pleasure quarter culture in vivid detail. His books were bestsellers, read across all levels of samurai society. There were also educational texts, manuals on sexual techniques, often based on Chinese medical traditions. These described positions, techniques for pleasure, and theories about sexual energy and health. Samurai considered this practical knowledge, not shameful material to hide. Poetry also contained sexual content, though often coded in elegant language. The classical Japanese poetry forms, waka and haiku, frequently included erotic themes. A poem about spring flowers might actually be about sexual awakening. A poem about morning dew might reference bodily fluids. Educated samurai understood these layers of meaning. All of this freedom, all of this sexual exploration and variety, applied only to men. Samurai women faced the complete opposite situation. A samurai wife was expected to be absolutely faithful to her husband. Any sexual impropriety, even a rumor of it, could destroy her and her entire family's reputation. Adultery by a samurai wife was technically a capital offense. A husband had the legal right to kill an adulterous wife and her lover on the spot. Even if he chose not to exercise that right, divorce was certain, and the woman would return to her family in disgrace, probably never to marry again. Samurai women were kept under surveillance, their movements were restricted, their interactions with men were controlled and supervised. They lived in the interior of the house, the okusan in her proper place, rarely venturing into the outside world. This isolation was protection, preventing any possibility of sexual scandal, but it was also imprisonment. The contrast is stark. A samurai man could have a wakashu, a wife, multiple concubines, and visit courtesans regularly, and all of this was socially acceptable. A samurai woman was expected to remain faithful to a husband she barely knew, who rarely spent time with her and who was openly intimate with others. Any deviation from perfect chastity meant ruin. This double standard was built into the structure of samurai society and was enforced absolutely. And yet, as we'll see in the next section, women found ways to navigate this system, to find moments of agency and even pleasure within the severe restrictions placed on their lives. Despite all the restrictions, samurai women weren't completely without agency or intimacy. They found ways to create connection within the limited spaces allowed to them. Historical records and literature hint at same-sex relationships between women in samurai households. Women lived in gender-separated spaces for long periods. Wives, daughters, servants, and ladies-in-waiting spent their days together with minimal male presence. In these environments, emotional and sometimes physical intimacy developed between women. The authorities didn't police female same-sex relationships the way they obsessed over female contact with men. There was a cultural blind spot. Relationships between women weren't seen as threatening to the social order because they couldn't produce illegitimate heirs or create succession confusion. So, they existed in a grey area, not openly celebrated like male practices, but also not actively suppressed. We have letters between samurai women that express deep affection and longing. We have literature that depicts female intimacy. Poetry written by women sometimes contains the same coded sexual references found in male poetry. The evidence is less abundant than for male sexuality, partly because women's writing was preserved less carefully, but it exists. Some powerful women wielded significant influence despite the restrictions. Hojo Masako, called the Nun Shogun, effectively ruled Japan after her husband's death in the 13th century. Women who became widows of daimyo sometimes governed domains during their son's minority. These were exceptions, but they show that the system had cracks where determined women could find power. Still, for most samurai women, life was lonely, restricted, and focused entirely on duty. Their sexuality was controlled, their movements limited, their worth measured by their sons. The contrast with male freedom was absolute and intentional. Not everything in samurai sexual culture was consensual or acceptable, even by the standards of the time. There were boundaries, and there were abuses. Female adultery was the most serious sexual crime. Wives caught in affairs faced death or permanent disgrace. The punishment was harsh because adultery threatened the certainty of bloodlines and inheritance. But male adultery carried no punishment at all. The asymmetry was total.